Welcome back, you hear of Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about a new release, Socialism, the Right, a Historical Study. This is a byproduct of sorts, which stemmed from the earlier book on Mussolini and fascism, and that concerned the origins of fascism and the specific policies enacted, because a lot of Western academics have this habit of focusing on World War II and ignoring all the importance in between info, which I think is actually quite interesting. But in any case, as I was doing that research, I noticed these little sparks and tidbits here and there which flew against our traditional image. So we think of left-wing socialist workers fighting for their rights and the fascist agents of the bourgeois pursuing a counter-revolution, where in fact these particular associations were explicitly right-wing or conservative socialist, rejecting both capitalism and communism, and advancing a rather unique model of their own. In this one, as far as characteristics are concerned, they're saying we want socialism, but we're not going to get rid of national identity, culture, religion, our land. We have to understand the importance of tradition, almost a corporatist model, respect for the medieval structure, the idea that feudalism, while some would say it was oppressive, they would make the argument, yeah, you are under the Lord, and you have certain obligations to him, paying taxes, but he also has to take care of you. So you've got the commons model, which is an early form of socialism. You can go there and graze or maybe plant something if your own land is not successful. But if there's a bad harvest, there should be grain stores, and he needs to open them and help you. The Lord needs to help the peasants so they don't starve. So it's a hierarchical form of socialism, but it's different from the modern, everything's about factories or just offices, which was actually the push of the left in many cases, outside of maybe Maoist China. So a big emphasis on myth, national myth, and especially anti-conservative, not necessarily that they didn't believe in respecting tradition, but anti the conservative elites, anti-liberalism, anti-communism, and skeptical of capitalism. So capitalism works to a certain degree, but not the banking system, not the usury, not the interest-generating system or the securities model where you make money supposedly without doing any physical labor. So we're going to just get started with some of the main topics. I'm trying to not be too much in depth because it could spoil parts of the book. But yellow socialism in France, which of course is preceded by Georges Sorel. A lot of discussion of his ideas. He's an interesting character. You have Drummond, you have the Boulangist organization. This right here, Pierre Bietri, who was one of the primary proponents of yellow socialism. He was kind of a disgruntled left-wing socialist. He said the strikes are not working. We need to have this harmonized model where the management and the workers cooperate for their common interests and by extension the interests of the country. And they need to reject the speculators, the finance capitalists, the banks that are trying to take the property out from underneath them and enslave them with debt. Then, of course, we have the Italian Social Republic, and if you've read the previous book, it's probably going to be a bit of a refresher, but historians try to dismiss it. They say it was just a propaganda fluke. This is false. Well documented that you had great advancements in the concept of public housing, workers doing these management councils, organizing their corporations, and the corporations themselves being nationalized, including fiat. Now, they do make exceptions for private property, but they say, and this just goes to the blog post I recently did on usufruct. So, possession versus private property. You can have private property providing you don't destroy it or violate the rights of others or go against the interests of the country. And this becomes more critical when we get into the Strasserism section. This is Rivera, and you have the National Syndicalist movement in Spain. Now some will say, but Franco came into power, that means they were successful. No. Francisco Franco was basically a military officer who aligned himself with the Catholic Church, with the monarchist groups, the Carlists, the Alfonsists, and of course you had the Falange, but the Falange was not always what Rivera wanted to be. In fact, he said explicitly, we can coordinate with Franco on anti-Marxism and being against Spanish separatist movements, but were not going to be subsumed because Rivera wanted a radical land reform, nationalization of all banks, elimination of the interest-generating system. Whereas Franco, when he came in, he was like, protect the big landowners, business. Not a whole lot of economic reform occurred under the Franco regime. So you see, just because you have a supposed fascist, they could just be a conservative defending the system, and they might very well be kind of pushing down the right-wing socialist. Similarly, on this point, Romania. Romania, I liked just researching it because it seemed to be one of the most authentic in that they didn't like taking corporate donations. They built their own little HQs around the country in a collective manner, just people making donations and volunteering their labor. They even had their own business leagues. And the idea was, we're going to go in, offer goods even cheaper than the Care Bears, people like myself, these evil foreigners, and we're going to drive them out of business like they've been trying to drive Romanians out of business. So that was actually that's a unique concept. Now, it perhaps should not be surprising, and the relative degree of anti-Care Bearism was dependent on really the population of the country and its cultural heritage. Romania had a lot of Care Bears. When they got closer to taking power, and it was briefly under the military dictatorship of Ion Antonescu, they were pretty brutal to the Care Bears. The system, I was almost reading, I was like, wow, this is crazy stuff that was going on. But it does show you the influence of that. If you believe that your country is under attack by these foreigners and they're taking your land, taking your trees, taking your whatever, and you have almost a spiritual conception, which Codreanu was very intensely religious. He thought of himself almost in parallel with Jesus Christ. You can see how much over the top it could go. But very crucially, when they got to a certain point where even Antonescu said, this is a bit much, he went ahead and he crushed the nationalists. So there you have a conservative military regime crushing a more avowedly social nationalist organization. It had been part of the government, but then it got kicked out. It was after like 4 or 5 months. So that's kind of important because the kosher conservatives and the leftists are going to say, that it's just an illusion, the idea of right-wing socialism. It exists. It's just hard because you're dealing with all these different power pools in one direction and the next. And then we get to Strasser. Now, a lot of people will say Strasserism is leftist Nazism. And I actually, initially, when I was writing the book, I was under that impression. Turns out that's not really accurate. So Strasser, his influences, which the section on Germany actually starts with early National Socialism, and not all National Socialisms were necessarily racial in nature. If you look at Mazzini, if you look at the French movements, but Strasser was certainly influenced by Mazzini, no question if you read both of their works. And then Arthur Mahler-Vandenbroek, who wrote the book Germany's Third Empire, which was very famous, he was saying there's a difference between being a conservative and a reactionary. And he was actually close friends with Otto Strasser. Then you have Oswald Spengler, Prussianism and Socialism. He said conservatives have to embrace socialism or cease to exist. With Strasser, he actually describes his own viewpoints as conservative realism. So that's where it's a socialism that looks in some respects towards the past. Now people say, yeah, but Strasserists, didn't they want to align with the Soviet Union? They did want, in some cases, closer relations. They did endorse certain forms of nationalization, like natural resources, which they thought had to be, part of the country. Remain with the people, I should say, not internationalized. But for the factories, it would be, I think, 49% private ownership, 41% state, and 10% workers. So you could say the workers and the state could overwhelm the capitalists if they wanted to. That's a possibility. More to the point, when it comes to land reform, he wanted a very expansive approach, much more so than what the Nazis did eventually, which is a little bit scaled down, but it was basically meant to be you would eliminate the Junkers who were holding a lot of the land, redistribute it. The state would own all the land. However, it would allow people to basically lease plots, and they could, grow stuff, run a business, whatever. But once they pass on, it would go to their son. If they didn't have a son or the son wasn't interested, it would go back to the community and they would dole it out to another ethnic German. The key point on that possession versus private property, you can't sell your land to a Care Bear or a Russian or a Chinese person. It has to remain with the people. For his political model, it's almost like the Swiss Confederation, very much a denationalized. You have a federal president, but there's layers of this varying different legislative chambers. So the smaller one elects the upper one, and it goes up to the top, and the president is appointing some people who have to be confirmed by the lower chamber. It's meant to prevent the rise of, he says, either communism or kind of Hitlerite National Socialism, Führerprinzip, where the leader just says stuff and it's done regardless of the Constitution. There's no limitations. So that's really crucial. Now, of course, it gets to the point of, was Hitler a socialist? And I think I do a pretty concrete job of explaining this. Yes, Hitler was a socialist. However, he was a national socialist. In this case, if you look at their policies, lower taxes for the working and middle class Germans, much higher for corporations and wealthy people. Also, a very effective use of currency exchange rates to get cheap goods for German soldiers to buy and ship back home. So yes, the working and middle class Germans prospered. They were pretty happy under the Nazis. But that, of course, came at the expense of very high taxes on, obviously Care Bears and any occupied territory. Even if that occupied territory was like Norway, where they were technically fellow Aryans. And it just gives you a sense that you can have this form of socialism, but someone is going to end up paying for it. It may not be like, oh, every country united, we're all workers. It says, well, our people are going to be elevated, but it is in this hierarchical scheme above other groups. That's how it's funded. And Hitler was really clear on it. Look, after the war, to continue on with this system, we're going to have to enslave more Slavs. We're going to have to tax them very high. They were even taxing the wages of forced laborers, which wages were low, but they were taxing them 50%. So kind of a crude and sadistic model, I guess. So that's my discussion about the book. If you're interested, do check it out. I will ask, if you buy the paperback, please let me know. I don't know if my copy is going to arrive soon enough because for whatever reason you can't order a copy until it's published. Please let me know if the image there, the sword and hammer crossed, if it prints out and it's like decent quality. I wasn't entirely sure just from the preview. If it turns out to be subpar, I have another cover already generated without, so I can just swap that. And if COVID's got you down, you can't afford to pay for it, you can get the ebook, and you have 7 days to read it, which is not too long. I think it's about like 100 pages, probably a little bit less because there are the citations in there. You can just read it, and then you can return it within 7 days for a refund. If you're just interested in the topic, but you're short on money, that's fine. Really, this is about education. It's not a business for me. But I do say if you read it and you enjoy it, please put a review and give your thoughts so other people might get interested as well. So that's the idea. If you want to take a look, I definitely am not going to discourage you from doing so.